The Learning Disabilities Association of America is proud to feature Dr. Jerome Schultz as the keynote speaker at the upcoming LDA Annual Conference in Atlanta, Georgia on Thursday, February 22nd, 2018. Dr. Schultz began his career as a special education teacher. He is a clinical neuropsychologist who, for over 35 years, has specialized in the assessment and treatment of children with learning disabilities and ADHD. Jerry serves as the research study coordinator in the GAB lab at Boston Children's Hospital. We welcome Jerry as he provides a short preview of his upcoming keynote session, Conquering the Fear Factor, helping kids with LD and ADHD turn stress into the fuel for success.
Excited about the opportunity to do the keynote at the upcoming conference in Atlanta, and excited to have a chance to give a little bit of a preview in this webinar. All my work these days is focusing on the impact of stress on how well kids' brains work, how stress affects and impacts their executive functions, how it gets in the way of learning, how it affects emotions, and how it affects behaviors, and especially in kids with learning disabilities. So that's the concern, the worry that underlies all of my work these days. And I've learned a lot about it over the last dozen years and more, last 35 years, but over the last 12 or 15 years, I've focused my attention on stress as a really important factor. I've given the label fear factor to the keynote because I think it says in very appropriate language what kids are experiencing when they're in a situation that they really can't handle. So I'm concerned because, all of us have a typical level of stress, the things that we deal with every day, what to wear, where we're going, whether technology is going to work well for us, or whether I'm going to pass a test. And I think it's important to acknowledge that kids with learning disabilities have that typical stress. But on top of that, they have specific kinds of stresses that are related to their condition, their specific learning disability. Because learning disabilities may affect the way kids perceive things, the way they process information, the way they retain information. So if you think about that, stress is really a double-edged sword for kids with learning disabilities. And I'm going to point out, for those kids who don't understand their stress, and for those kids who don't have teachers and parents and other adults who understand their stress and how to help them deal with it. I'm really concerned about the level of toxic stress that a lot of kids are under. And remember that toxic stress happens when we don't feel like we have any control over threatening events. It's my belief that there are a lot of kids with learning disabilities because they don't understand their learning disability, or the teachers they're working with may not understand their learning disability, that they sit in school feeling fearful all day long. They worry that they're going to be called out and they're going to look unintelligent, when in fact they're really bright kids who have a specific condition that makes learning challenging. But if you consider that if you've got kids sitting in school feeling like they don't have any control over their academic destiny, that induces a reaction in the brain, a biochemical reaction that actually makes learning worse. So for kids with learning disabilities who are under stress, they're dealing with a compound problem. And that's one of the things I want to talk about at the keynote address. Kids who are under toxic stress exhibit a lot of behaviors that are often associated with kids, negative behaviors that are associated with kids with learning disabilities. They resist us as parents and teachers. They avoid tasks. They may run and hide. They may go to the nurse's office. They may get sick more often. These are kids who freeze in place like the proverbial deer in the headlight. These are kids who run. Little kids leave the classroom. Kids don't come to school at all when they're under this kind of stress. Or they fight us. They say, I don't want to do this. Why are you making me do this? You're making my life miserable. I hate you. These reflect and explain much of the negative behavior that we see in kids with learning disabilities. It's my belief, Beth, that toxic stress is the underpinning for a lot of these behaviors. And once we understand it, and once we help kids understand when they're under stress and the impact of stress on their behavior and their learning, they get much better. It's a simple, easy to implement intervention that the good news is it costs no money to do this, but it requires that we think about kids and the impact of stress in a way that we haven't done before. I created a handout which I'll give out at the conference, but as you can see in front of you on the left-hand side, kids who have been inoculated against stress exhibit these positive qualities on the left-hand side of this graph. Kids who are chronically under stress exhibit the behaviors that are on the right-hand side of the graph. The key to this is somewhere in the middle. Kids who are inoculated against stress, who understand its impact, are kids who can say, I can do this, I will do this. I like school, I'm on task most of the time, I'm operating on what I've come to call the cusp of my competence. These kids feel confident and competent most of the time. In comparison, in contrast with kids who are under stress who say, I can't do this, so I won't do this. They back off, they feel out of control. They stay back from the edge. They don't look for challenges. They don't feel very competent or confident most of the time during their day. And that's a setup for continued experience with failure and not continued experience with stress. I think that's the last, actually there's one more slide in here. Just some contact information for me. I say here, I can't wait to see you in Atlanta in February. I hope many of you come. There are a wonderful array of sessions that are scheduled for everybody at the conference, and it's a great event. Those of you who have been there before know that. That's why you're coming back. If you haven't been to an LDA national conference, you're in for a treat. If you want to contact me before the conference, you see my contact information here, and I invite you to follow me on Twitter, and we'll stay in touch. I'm going to turn the screen back over to both of us now, and we can talk a little bit.
Great, great. Well, I certainly can't wait to attend that session. You were the keynote with LDA several years ago.
Yeah.
What kind of research has been done in the field of LD and stress since then?
It's really a great question. I was just finishing my book back at the time I did the other keynote. My book came out in 2011, so I think I must have been to the keynote in 2010 or 2011. And since that time, one of the things that's happened is that I've traveled around the country, around the world, doing presentations on this topic of stress because it's such an important topic. And what I've learned a lot about, how I've learned a lot about stress is because I get these great questions from teachers and administrators and brain scientists all over the world, forcing me to come up with the answers or find the knowledge to answer the question. So a lot more people are looking at this as a serious concern. There aren't a lot of people, frankly, who are looking at the connection between about how stress impacts kids with learning disabilities specifically, but a lot more people are realizing that unless you deal with the stress first, that it gets in the way so much that it makes the learning disability and its consequences worse. So there is research that's going on. I have the good fortune now this year, I started working with the Gabb Lab at Children's Hospital in Boston, run by Nadine Gabb, who did the keynote, one of the keynote presentations last year at LDA. She's fantastic and brilliant, and she's doing this cutting edge research that looks at the brains of little babies to look for biological markers of learning disabilities early in life, even as young as 2 and 3 months, so that specific interventions can be developed to help these kids not have the struggles that so many kids have today. So I'll speak more about that at the conference, and if you're interested in finding out more about it, Google the Gabb Lab, G-A-A-B-L-A-B, and learn some more about the project. But yes, a lot more research is being done. What needs to happen is things have to change in homes and classrooms so that kids aren't under this chronic stress that they're under, and they'll get better. They'll be happier. They'll be more successful.
Can you kind of think of like 3 takeaways that people will get from the keynote on February 22nd?
Yeah. Well, one thing I want people to learn about is, I used to say in the olden days, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I wish there were an app for that. And actually, since I gave the keynote last time, an app has been developed that allows kids and anybody to measure their cortisol levels. And as you know, cortisol is one of the hormones that is involved in the stress response. Now it's possible, it sounds like science fiction, but for kids to monitor their own cortisol levels, to have their cortisol levels instantaneously read over a computer by connecting them with a large database, and then let kids learn exercise like meditation and mindfulness practices and good educational practices that help them monitor their stress level, and they can measure how that's being done. That's still in its experimental stages. I'm trying to work with a school system now that is trying to implement this as a research project. So that's one of the things that I'll be talking about, and one takeaway. So if anybody leaves this and they say, hey, I want my kids to do this, my school to do this, we should talk at the conference after the session. The other takeaway I think that's really important for me is kids get blamed for a lot of the behaviors that we see that are negative in the home and in the class. And I think one of the takeaways for me is if you consider that underlying stress may be a possible factor, that it helps to explain this behavior, it'll be easier for us to look at kids who are showing symptoms of the stress rather than being or looking like bad kids who happen to have learning disabilities. I think that's an important factor. So those are a couple of things that I think people will be able to take away from this. Some very practical advice about how to turn things around at home and in the classroom, which makes me feel good. If the conference goers are coming as teams, either from schools or as two parents coming together, make a list of the kinds of sessions that you want to go to the sessions separately, come back and share with each other what you've learned. You maximize your input in that way. If you're coming from a school, go back and tell the administrator of your program, the principal of the school, what you've learned and how excited you are, and try to share that enthusiasm and spread that enthusiasm. When there's leadership in public schools, a lot of great things happen to kids and for kids. And this conference can be a catalyst for that. That would be my hope, that you go away with this with a few more things than you came in with. And those things are going to make an appreciable difference in the lives of kids you work with.
Wow, that's great advice. Thank you. Well, thank you, Jerry. We look forward to your presentation. The conference is February 21st to the 24th, but you'll be speaking on the 22nd. So thank you for sharing with us today, Jerry. And
my pleasure, Beth.
I can't wait to see you in February.
Me too. I can't wait to see all of you out there in TV or computer land. Come on down, as they say.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.